Hello, my fellow kindred souls. Now, as we're looking at Hermetic wisdom, in this video I want to bring to you some information about one of the true warriors of light who, against all odds, continued to bring the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus to enrich humanity. These geniuses and philosophers were the martyrs of their time, and we should never forget their courage and strength. For without them, these sacred texts would have been forgotten and destroyed by the darkness and corruption of the Catholic Church. This video will be about one such martyr, Giordano Bruno, and this information is taken from an article by Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, written for New Dawn magazine. In our last New Dawn article, we listed the great pioneering discoveries of science that, unacknowledged by science historians, were directly inspired by an ancient Egyptian ideas as set out in the Hermetic texts which were ascribed to the demigod Hermes Trismegistus. These landmark breakthroughs were either drawn directly from cosmology of the Hermetica, the most important being Copernicus's heliocentric theory, or indirectly by applying their principles to different areas, as did Isaac Newton to crack the code of gravity. But most of the discoveries on our list involved a figure who, although not an experimental scientist himself, should be remembered as being equally important as Copernicus and Newton, but who until recently was virtually erased from history. This towering genius and truly extraordinary man was Giordano Bruno, the foremost Hermetic philosopher of his age, whose influence over the scientific revolution has been scandalously downplayed. There's even more to him than his intellectual and philosophical genius. He has also applied the Hermetic principles to social, political, and religious questions. And he presented such a serious challenge to the supremacy of the Church that for a time he even threatened to undermine it. But it also, with sickening inevitability, led to a date with a flaming fire in Rome. In recent years, Bruno has begun to be rediscovered and appreciated, although still the truth is often distorted in order to crowbar him into the accepted history of science. Because of his remarkably advanced ideas, he tends to be regarded as a martyr for scientific rationalism, victim of even greater church persecution than Galileo, on whom he was hugely influential. Bruno has become a hero for three thinkers, and particularly, ironically, atheists, who gather annually at the site of his execution in Rome, Campo di Fiori, marked by a statue erected in the late 19th century to honour his memory and sacrifice. But this is missing the point in a big way. Far from being an arch-materialist rationalist, in fact everything Bruno did was inspired by his passionate belief in magic and the esoteric. Ironically, Bruno began as a Dominican monk, a member of the same order that gave rise to his nemesis, the Inquisition. He was born in 1548 in a small town of Nola, hence his nickname, the Nolan, in the then huge kingdom of Naples in Italy, which was under Spanish rule. Although he was christened Filippo, he took the name Giordano from the river Jordan on entering the Dominican monastery in Naples at the age of 16. In those days, becoming a monk was the only way for a bright lad, and Bruno had already exhibited a prodigious intellect from a humble background to get a good education. The young monk soon distinguished himself with his extraordinary mastery of memory training, even being summoned to Rome to demonstrate the ability to the Pope. The classical art of memory, based on the manipulation of mental images, had a magical counterpart which employed talismanic principles to induce rather than simply recall information. Clearly, this possessed a heady allure to someone so hungry for knowledge as Bruno. As he grew in ability, exploring the powers of the mind through magic and psychology, Bruno became a powerfully confident man. Although never lacking in self-belief, he always respected those who deserved respect. On the other hand, he was disinclined to suffer fools gladly, indeed at all. as he always, without fail, believed in his own mission. A side of this self-belief that was hardly welcome in a monk was his refusal to allow others to dictate what he could read or even think. Not only were monks' studies tightly circumscribed by their very nature, but at the time the Catholic Church was desperately trying to combat the rise of Protestantism. So departing even marginally from the conventional line attracted great suspicion. Even listening to the arguments of those deemed heretics or reading their works was a crime for a monk, even if you disagreed with them. On the other hand, as the Dominicans were tasked with fighting heresy, they had easy access to banned books, much to the ever-curious Bruno's delight. When his superiors discovered he had been secretly reading them in the monastery toilet, he fled from Naples. For 5 years he wandered around the intellectual centres of northern Italy, southern France and Switzerland, Padua, Milan, Geneva, Toulouse, amongst other places, with frequent gaps in his biography. By the time he reappears fully in Paris in 1581, he had become a hardcore believer in the Renaissance occult philosophy with Hermeticism at its heart. Quite how he developed this interest is unknown, but it fundamentally underpinned everything he did for the rest of his life. Like everyone inspired by the Hermetic books since their rediscovery in Europe just over a century before, Bruno was fired up with their vision of humans as glorious, miraculous beings of limitless potential, the polar opposite of what all Catholics were taught. To them, humans were little better than worms, only achieving a tiny bit of God's grace through the intercession of the Church. And even that often dependent on how much you were prepared to pay the priesthood to be let off a few years in purgatory. The more he studied, the more Bruno considered everything, every level of life and understanding of our place within the cosmos could be illuminated by the principles of Hermeticism. In Paris, he gained the patronage of the French king, Henry III, a Catholic, but who still had a deep interest in the esoteric and was tolerant towards the French Protestants and Huguenots. After 2 years, Bruno moved to London, accompanying Henry's new ambassador to Queen Elizabeth I's court. Clearly, he had Henry's backing for whatever his mission might have been, probably establishing contact with the English Magi centred around John Dee. During his 2-year stay in London, he made friends with such luminaries as Sir Philip Sidney and wrote some of his most important books. As we will see, Bruno left a rich intellectual legacy that influenced some of the great minds of the late flowering English Renaissance. Many consider that the character of Veroni in Shakespeare's Love Labour's Lost was based on Bruno. It was while in London that Bruno produced his major works on cosmology that were to inspire enormous scientific advances. To Bruno, the Hermetic philosophy and cosmology was the great key to unlocking the secrets of nature and the cosmos. Having already seen the Hermetica inspire Copernicus to develop his heliocentric theory, he applied himself to scientific questions using the Hermetic principles, and very fruitful it proved too. A passage in Treatise 10 of the Corpus Hermeticum states that the spirit passing through the veins and arteries moves the living thing. Bruno realized the images suggest that the blood also moves, a concept that also reflected Hermetic ideas of a man as a microcosm of the greater cosmos. Bruno's interpretation was picked up by fellow Hermeticist Robert Flood, who, writing in the late 1610s, inspired Charles I's physician William Harvey with the idea of testing it. Harvey became the first person to demonstrate that the circulation of blood experimentally, one of the greatest achievements of the scientific revolution. Bruno's Hermetic influence also extended to Elizabeth I's position, William Gilbert's 1600 masterwork on the magnet, magnetic bodies, and great magnet of Earth, in which he proposed that magnets work because the Earth itself generates magnetic force, another landmark discovery. Without Bruno's work, Gilbert would have never got there. In our bullet point list of Hermetic-inspired discoveries in our last article, we included the basic principles of computer science and information theory. At first glance, this may seem rather unlikely, but this, too, can be traced back to Bruno's application of Hermetic principles. This time, the seed he planted flowered in Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German genius whose life and career paralleled those of Isaac Newton. A great polymath, Leibniz is chiefly known today for inventing infinitesimal calculus at about the same time as Newton, although Leibniz's system was the one that caught on, and for the basic principles of information theory, including the binary system. Yet even Leibniz was no hardline materialist rationalist. Like Newton, he was deeply versed in esotericism, almost certainly a Rosicrucian, and certainly a scholar of the Kabbalah, and predictably the Hermetica. Equally predictably, he owed an enormous debt to the works of Giordano Bruno. Information theory was really just a byproduct of the much more ambitious scheme. Leibniz believed it should be possible to devise a set of symbols which he called the Characteristica Universalis, to represent all the fundamentals of knowledge, and by manipulating them to make new discoveries, a process he described as innocent magia. He developed this idea from Bruno's works, especially those on the magical art of memory and the manipulation of the imagination to produce desired results. Although Leibniz was never to achieve the full dream of the Characteristica Universalis, his work developed into the idea of mathematical modelling, at first using pen and paper equations, which is where calculus came in, and later computer modelling. His pioneering computer work also saw him designing some of the first calculating machines. But although Bruno can never be described as a scientist in his own right, he seems never to have undertaken a single experiment. Based on his reasoning on the Hermetic principles, led him to make some truly remarkable insights. And given that he practiced magical techniques to acquire information directly, we can be forgiven for wondering just how successful they were. In London in 1584, Bruno wrote and published On the Infinite Universe and Worlds, in which he put forward some extraordinarily advanced and, for the time, deeply shocking propositions. And that's where I will leave it for part 1, and I will upload part 2 shortly.